Welcome to Time Capsule. I'm Mark Kenny. This is Steve Stone. Steve and I are with the Portsmouth Historical Society, and today we're talking with Paul Murphy. Paul is the chairman of the Butt Hill Fort's Restoration Committee. Thanks for joining us today, Paul.
Great to be here.
So the fort is in Portsmouth. It had a significant role in the Revolutionary War. Maybe just to set the scene, Paul, if you could tell us where the Revolutionary War was in the summer of 1778 as we go into this.
Yeah, it's a kind of a big question, but the fort itself, in context of the entire Revolution, really makes a name for itself in August 29, 1778, which is the Battle of Rhode Island date. So the fort itself, though, the fort proper that sits in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, has been there for the last 250 years. It was constructed, occupied, used over the entire course of the Revolutionary War. So from 1776 to 1782-3. It's a very unique place. It exists as the largest existing Revolutionary War earthwork in all of New England. So just on that basis alone, I think it's worth preserving. So our group is all volunteer. A lot of local names you'd recognize. Jim Garman, you mentioned, was on this previous show. All stalwart member. Gloria Schmidt, another town historian. Craig Clark. There's a cast of many people involved. Like I said, we're all volunteer. It's a labor of love, really. But the fort itself, back to that. So the Revolutionary War happens, we like to date things from the burning of the Gadsby in 1772. A lot of things are going on in Narragansett Bay in the early part of, even before Lexington and Concord in 1775. So there's smuggling, there's privateering, there's a lot of tension between the British government and the colonial folks that live and work inside Narragansett Bay. So it's hard to actually put a date time stamp on exactly when things become strategic or meaningful. But the British themselves, as a sea power, are the major power of the day. Anywhere that a British ship can go, British power can go. So if you look at the American colonies in 1775, and again, they haven't rebelled yet, but they're getting together and they all have the same griefs. But if you look at, as big as the British Empire we think of is today, in 1776, there's only 2.5 million total people in the colonies, all British subjects. There's also 400,000 plus enslaved Africans, mostly in the southern, almost exclusively in the southern colonies, but there are some up the north. But that's the size of the entire population. And Newport itself, which is a great seaport, was the 6th largest city, believe it or not, in the colonies. So Philly's the biggest with like 40,000, and then New York, Boston, Charleston, but there's 11,000 population in Newport, which makes it a huge, very huge seaport. So it and Narragansett Bay are very strategic. Fast forwarding to when the Americans, the entire lead up to Lexington and Concord happens in 1775 up in Boston. Many events that go into that. The British evacuate Boston in March 1776. They take their fleet and all loyalists, they go to Halifax. The British government rethinks what is it going to do now. So it basically sends a huge invasion force to take New York City, which they do. They take Long Island. They land, they have 400 ships, 32,000 troops. It's the biggest armada that the British Empire has ever put to sea, goes to New York City. Won't get into the details on that, but they take Long Island, they take New York, they take New Jersey. They then decide they're going to park a fleet in a much nicer harbor, which is Newport. So they send the Lord Howe, who's the British commander, there's brothers, the Land Howe has New York City. Sea Howe says, I want to put my ships in a nice, secure harbor, which Newport is. And since the Americans aren't using it and they've just evacuated Boston, it's a great place to park forces, including naval forces, which can not only guard Narragansett Bay, which is strategic itself, but also to suppress privateers, smuggling, that kind of things. So that's why they end up putting a force back in New England, a large force, on Aquidneck Island, but only on Aquidneck Island. They take Jamestown and Aquidneck Island, which is in the middle. I'll go to a map. You can see Aquidneck Island sits right in the middle of Narragansett Bay. It's protectable, and that's another thing the British like, is if it's on the ocean or accessible to the ocean, they can defend it. So with a fleet on the city end in Newport, on the north end where the high ground is, it controls you want to have control of the two ferries that are the most important, which is the one to Bristol and the one to Tiverton. That's where most of the goods, services, and logistics come that are going to feed the island. So when the British do arrive, though, war is essentially broken out. They get here in late 1776. They've taken New York, but they are now in enemy territory. So they have Aquidneck Island, but everywhere else around the entire bay is in colonial militia hands. So not really in rifle shot, but they're close enough to see, observe each other the entire war. So for 3 years, the British maintain Aquidneck Island, kind of uninterrupted. Butts Hill Fort sits at the top. It's the high ground. It's not it's almost the highest point on the island, but it's definitely the highest point on the north side. So from the high ground at Butts Hill Fort, you can see why they chose it. You have a commanding view of Bristol. You can still see the bridge, and looking the other way, you have a commanding view of Tiverton. Now they had fortifications down lower, but the high ground makes the most sense to fortify. So the British are actually the ones that. There's some writing about the Americans used it and fortified it, but it doesn't make sense as a strategic location until the British actually hold the island. Then it becomes very strategic, and the British are professionals. They immediately dig in, build a fort, start fortifying, and also lay plans for a 200-man barracks also on the top to basically have forces that are, it's 8 or 10 miles from Newport, to have troops stationed in the north that have like barracks, places to live in the winter. So they do that in 1777. So that's what that's basically the genesis of the fort itself. We'll jump back, but fast forwarding to the battle happens in 1778, but the French arrive in 1780. They actually bring their engineers with them. There's an entire engineering corps that actually take 2 British forts and make it into one single fort. And that's the fort that we have today. That's the fort that has survived 250 years. That's adjacent to Portsmouth High School. So that's what we're restoring. So that's kind of an outside nutshell on what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely not. That's great. And then in terms of the Battle of Rhode Island itself, I understand it was surprisingly large number of forces on each side. Can you talk a little bit about the battle itself and the Americans, the Hessians, the British?
Sure. So again, when the British do get here, they have a garrison and a fleet, smaller ships. When the again, backing up to the strategy, the British have taken New York, but now they're trying to cut off. In this phase of the war, they're trying to basically cut off the New England, which is the troubling colonies, from the rest of the what they think are more loyalist southern colonies. So the 1777, just to back up because it doesn't make sense without it, the British have their 3-pronged plan to go north to Albany, come south from Canada, and east from the West Coast, and it all meets up in Saratoga, and they lose. But that is supposed to be the war-winning event. What happens, though, is because they lose 5,000 men at Saratoga, the French enter the war in February, which is hugely critical to how we end up with a battle in Rhode Island. Because now the British have lost an entire army in New York. Now they have to completely rethink their strategy all over again. But what it does do is it brings the French into the war. So the French bring a fleet of 20 ships and 4 frigates over to the United States to do some goodness in early 1778. So they thought they were going to go to Philadelphia, didn't quite work out. They thought they were going to try New York, too strong. They go, well, we can go to Newport where there's 5,000 or so British troops and some ships, and we can work with the Americans and kind of do land and sea pincer movement, kind of like we end up doing at Yorktown. So that's the plan. So without the French doing that, but with the French now on our side and sending a force that big, Washington detaches troops, about 3,000 varsity, I call them, American Continental Militia, Continental Line, to go and join the New England militias, which are being raised. They're not permanent troops, but they get raised every once in a while. So altogether, there's about 11,000 Americans that are going to convene. The French show up with their armada, which also has a few thousand, 1,000 to 3,000, however you want to call it, French troops aboard the ships. And they're going to come into the bay, and they're going to be the sea power that basically puts the British force of 5,000 in Newport in a vice. That's how things happen. So and it all happens about 1 month in 1778. It's kind of amazing. So in August, in early August of 1778, the French fleet arrives. The local British commanders decide. In those days, it was if you lose your ships, you're gonna. It's bad. If you have a lesser ship that's outclassed, you can sink it yourself, and there's honor in that. So, and you don't want to get anything captured. So the British set about sinking 4 of their own frigates, plus a couple of gunboats and other items. They blocked the harbor with the ship the Endeavour, which is very famous now for having been sunk. That's why it was sunk, to block the harbor from the French. The British start spiking their own ships. They also know the Americans are coming under General Sullivan, who's the senior commander on the scene. He's the theater commander, we'd call him today. The Continentals come up. They're commanded by Lafayette. And Greene, at the last minute, gets sent as an advisor. He doesn't want to overpower Sullivan, Washington, with Greene. But Nathaniel Greene, our own Nathaniel Greene, comes to Rhode Island and is treated as a hero when he shows up, but he ends up being pretty much one of the second in commands to Sullivan for the whole battle. So he's right at, which I think is very unique also, because it's the only time I know of that Nathaniel Greene actually fights with troops in Rhode Island, which is our, so he's kind of the second most important general in all of the Revolution. He's from Rhode Island, and this is where he fought, right here in Portsmouth. So that's pretty cool.
Very cool. Interesting.
So back to Newport. So it's August. It's early August. Everything happens in August 1778. The British have arrived. The French have arrived. The Americans get on the island on about the 9th of August. They go down. The British know that they're going to get trapped on top of the island. We showed a picture of where the island is. This one. The British up at Butts Hill, which now has a fort and a barracks on it, and a garrison, and all the troops up north, they realize that the Americans are going to try to jump on the island, and the French are going to try to get them from the bottom. So they think they're going to get trapped up in this part of Aquidneck Island. So the commander withdraws all of the forces the British have back into the Newport perimeter, basically, because they're going to get sieged on by overwhelming forces. So things are going well. And then the British do send a relief column, which is again a varsity set of ships that come up to basically draw the French fleet out, which they do. So on March 10th, the French fleet actually materializes. The British fleet actually materializes in the Long Island Sound around Point Judith. The French, who are just unloading their first bunch of troops, have to put them back on. They decide to put them back on board and go out and fight the British in a traditional, big power on big power naval sea battle on May 10th, and they do. They go out. The Americans are just observing all this, but that happens. The famous hurricane starts as a gale, works its way into a hurricane as shots are starting to get fired, and both fleets get scrambled and pretty damaged. So you have basically a major fleet battle. Could have been decisive. That basically there are shots fired. There is some damage done, but most of the damage is done by the storm to both fleets. So the French commander, the most expensive things on planet Earth in the 18th century are men of war. So if the king sends you with a bunch of ships, your big thing is preserve the fleet. So he makes the decision, this is a great campaign, but I'm taking my fleet and going to Boston to refit because Boston's friendly. The British, likewise, Hogg does the same thing, goes to New York with his ships. No more ships. So now it's back to the land battle, but you still have about 10,000 American militia and Continentals on siege lines to Newport. The Americans are hoping that the French will come back. In fact, there's some famous ruffled feathers because it's the first time that the French, who have been the perennial enemy for decades with everyone in New England, right? They're the French are the enemy, have suddenly left. And, you know, they were supposed to be here, they were supposed to be helping us, and now they're sailing away to Boston, you know. So Sullivan and some of the higher echelon command are not very well pleased with this. There's a lot of back and forth, you know, name calling, you'd say. You know, the French commander, D'Estaing, he's very aware that this is very important to keep you know, so he doesn't take offense too bad, but he's like, I'm going to Boston. So Sullivan and Greene, Lafayette, by the way, gets sent to Boston to smooth feathers because he's obviously a Frenchman, so he can go help smooth things back out. Meanwhile, back at Newport, the Americans are now fighting very good British and Hessian troops, like 5,000, 6,000 of them, with their mostly militia and Continentals. And the British are dug in, and the Americans come down the island. They do dig in, but they have to make a decision: do we really want to attack without the French, which would be very costly if they could do it. So they lay siege. There's a lot of gunfire traded. There's a lot of discussion about whether or not to attack on either the Coddington side or on the where the mansions are now on the other side. But they decide not to. As the month wears on, they get word that the French are definitely not coming back, and that there's a British relief column coming back up from New York. So they know the clock is ticking. So they have to make a decision. Either we attack or we leave. So they make a council of war that they're going to leave the siege line. So quietly, Sullivan starts to move all of his heavy equipment and cannons and things like that up to the defensive lines, which are up across the island, on the top of the island in front of Butts Hill Fort, but all the way from shore to shore, because they knew that the ferry's behind them, and that would always be the last line of defense. So the American effort moves to the north of the island. So they do finally pull out on the 29th or 28th, early on the 29th of August, same August. The British realize what they're doing. By this point, a lot of the militia has also melted away already. They've sort of left, so the troops they're more evenly matched, but the Americans still have more troops. The British commander Pigot, P-I-G-O-T, realizes what they're doing in those days. Best thing you can do is pursue an enemy who's retreating. So they're obviously retreating. The Americans do a nice job of moving most of their troops that night back to the north. They leave rear guards on both the East and West Main, which are just like East and West Main today. That's one thing about Aquidneck Island, is all the streets are still here, just like they were back then, including Middle Road. And so the British, he sends a few thousand British troops up the East Main Road, and basically mostly Hessian contingent up the West Main Road. And on the West Main Road, they meet Laurens and his advance guard troops, and on the other side, they meet Livingston. And so basically, the Americans are expecting troops to come at them. And there is skirmishing, including ambushes. Some of the heaviest casualties we are now in the battle day of the Battle of Rhode Island, which is the 29th, which is a fighting withdrawal. There's major ambushes, like at the corner of Union and East Main, right where Portsmouth Historic Society is. The Americans stand up and fire 2 volleys at the British coming up, who don't expect it, and there's about 13 British KIA on just right there alone. There's some serious, damage. Again, the Americans continue to move backwards. The British are not used to seeing blue coats, like nice blue coats that the Continentals have. They're used to looking at militia, so they think a lot of the blue coats in front of them are actually Hessians, and they're not. They're actually Americans. They're American Continentals, so there's a lot of confusion on the uniforms. So there's a pretty hot fight going up all the way. This all happens between like 7 in the morning and like 10 in the morning on East Main Road and West Main Road. And again, we're talking about a fighting retreat of miles at a time, up to Turkey Hill on the left side and up to Quaker Hill eventually on the right side. And there's a pretty good seesaw battle on top of Quaker Hill. In fact, the Battle of Rhode Island is often called the Battle of Quaker Hill in some of the history books because most of the fighting happens on that high ground. Meanwhile, though, the British, who are under orders not to get into a general fight, are now in a general engagement, basically. But Sullivan and most of the troops are dug in right across the line at in front of Butts Hill. Let me just find that in a minute. The show's 2 p.m. in the afternoon, but it's a great shot because you get to see the forces. These are British forces on Quaker Hill, Turkey Hill to the left. These are Hessians. And then the Americans are dug straight across the island with Butts Hill Fort at the top. So the battle continues. The famous 1st Rhode Island Regiment is in a redoubt over here on West Main, which is a British redoubt, but all these defenses have been turned around by the Americans as soon as they get on the island. Turned around meaning fortifications that were looking out to sea are now looking south down East and West Main Road to cover down both approaches. So that's what they're doing. The Hessians famously fight their way 3 times towards the redoubt, which gets reinforced on the American side. But the 1st Rhode Island, where Continentals actually do a great job, there's 140 of them. They lose, they do have casualties. They do a great job. So do the other American troops that come down and reinforce. The British, the Hessians at that point are pretty mad. They try 3 times. It doesn't work. They decide to retreat back to the top of the hill. So in Portsmouth, if you're familiar, there's Quaker Hill, Turkey Hill, Elmy Hill, a valley where like Clements and Turnpike Highway is, and then you go back up high ground again. So the Americans are on that high ground. The British are on that high ground. They're about evenly matched by this point. And at this point in the war, nobody wants to do a frontal assault. So that's kind of how the Battle of Rhode Island ends, with a night withdrawal from the Tiverton ferry side, the Howlands Ferry. And that's the end of the battle.
Very interesting, Paul. That's great. So you were talking about the revisions to Fort Butts. Mm-hmm. How many were there, and who actually ended up designing the way that we have it right now?
Yeah, it's great question. The fort itself, so at the beginning, the British, they have a slide for this, established back in 1777 when they get on, they put a gun battery, a 6-gun, probably 18-pounders battery on the north part of what is now one fort, but at the time was 2 different forts, overlooking the Bristol ferry and the Bristol direction, with a magazine behind it, and they enclose that. A little bit over, they build a 200-man barracks, and we know that because we have the maps, and we also have reports of them, owning and occupying the place as almost like 2 side-by-side parallel installations. So the British, from the minute they get there, are digging in, building this thing. They're planning it. They build the fort. Interestingly, when they retreat in 1778, they don't burn the barracks behind them. They leave it, knowing they'll come back, or they figure they'll come back, and they do. And then when they leave on their own volition, a year after the Battle of Rhode Island in 1779, they leave the island. They leave Rhode Island in general because now they're fighting a world war. The Americans get back on the island. Again, there's no enemy on the island, so the Americans take the fort back, but it's still in the condition the British left it, essentially. 6 months later, the French come back with Rochambeau, which is the famous big contingent that comes back in 1780, lands in Newport, takes the island, parks the French fleet unopposed in Newport as a great place to have a French fleet. The French want the entire island defended, just like the old, like you would back in Europe, and they demand, they're paying for it, but they demand that we want to have a proper fort at the top of the island. So Lafayette himself, on a staff ride, goes out and says, we need to make these 2 forts into one proper fort, is what he says. And he writes it down, and the French have the best engineers in the world. and there's 9 of them with the Army. These guys are, you know, all professional engineers. They lay out, well, the redans and the what we have now is the outer works of the forts that are connected, and they set to work with work details, which are French, rotating French troops, but also American troops with picks and shovels. It's not the population is mostly Quaker. They famously don't want to help the British with anything that's warlike. But by this point in the war, there's not a whole lot of population in Portsmouth anyway. So most of the work done at Butts Hill Fort in any of, whether it's British or French, is done by troops. American troops, French troops, British troops, you know, Hessian troops. So from June 1780 until they marched to Yorktown the next year, the French are improving the fort. For at least 6 months, they do, you know, great work in 1781 until they leave. So the fort we have on our hands that exists today is the final outline and the final plan, essentially, of how the French left it on their way to Yorktown.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see. We used to have a little bit of time left.
Sorry.
What was the? No, that's all right. What was there before Fort Butts?
A hill, Windmill Hill. It was
Windmill
just a
Hill.
private hill. Yep. The British called it Windmill Hill because apparently there was an old school windmill, so that's what they called it, Windmill Hill. The family, Butts family, is who owned most of the hills, so that's why on the American side it was Butts Hill. So on the maps it's Butts Hill. The British called it Windmill Hill, but it's basically a rural pasture land on the top of the hill.
Let's see.
Can I jump in for a
Yes,
second?
absolutely,
So I
Mark.
just want to credit Paul the amazing restoration work that you and your team have done
Yeah.
at the fort. It's really
thanks.
remarkable. Given that interesting history, if folks want to get involved in that project, how would they go about contacting you or getting involved?
Sure, you can drop a note. Happy to take you. We do have periodic clearings that are in the local papers, or you know, by periodic clearing, you can come out, volunteer to, you know, tear out invasive vegetation or help clear up. We've done a lot of heavy work. We're always looking for people, though, to help just in general, or financial would be great also, because we're 100% volunteer, so anything we do with major equipment we have to rent by or something like that. So it would be the Battle of Rhode Island organization. The Battle of Rhode Island Association is our 501c arm. We're the Butts Hill Fort Restoration Committee, but Battle of Rhode Island Association is the 501c. So we're one and the same, essentially.
Okay.
But that's if you want to reach out, you can reach out to via the website.
Excellent. We'll put that up as part of this video.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks
Yep.
so much. That's fascinating. Really
Yeah.
appreciate you coming out today.
Thank
bet.
you, Paul. That was fantastic.
Awesome.
Very
Thank you.
good.
Well, thank you, Paul. Thanks for everything, and perhaps we'll see you again on the next time capsule.
Well, thank you, Steve and Mark. Really appreciate you guys having us over. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you.